class is mobile journalism, and we're
Uh-huh.
focusing on the ethical um, issues that have arisen during the 21st century.
Sure.
And we are doing a community of practice, right? And by interviewing you, we'd like a expertise point of view. And first off, our question is, what are some key changes that you have noticed in journalism over the last 15 years, would you say?
Well, certainly probably the three biggest changes in the last 15 years directly with what you're studying here, and one of them is um, the ability for people both to consume journalism and practice journalism on mobile devices. That the first smartphones, weren't even invented 15 years ago. We had cell phones that some of them had texting capability, but no apps and things that you could do social media on. And of course, social media didn't exist 15 years ago. Facebook didn't start probably till '04, Twitter till '06, and Periscope earlier this year, and so on. So the increase of social media, which has both given journalists and the public tools that we can use in different ways to both consume media and to create media, and both of those developments relate to probably the biggest development, which had actually started 15 years ago, but it's really accelerated in this century, and that was the ability of individuals rather than media companies to create media, to tell their stories, shoot videos, post pictures, blog, tweet, Facebook, whatever. They're telling their own stories, and sometimes those stories overlap with journalism. Sometimes they're completely separate from journalism. They're just creative writing. It could be fiction, fantasy, whatever, pornography for that matter. But the ability of people to create their own media has grown considerably with both of those developments of social media and mobile media, mobile devices.
And do you think that these changes have resulted in any unethical practices?
Well, that depends on what you mean. Certainly, these developments have resulted in people who aren't journalists creating content that's not necessarily journalism, and so whether that's ethical depends on the ethics of their particular professions and everything. That a citizen, telling a story about something that happened to him or her, maybe has a general, human obligation or some morality to be honest, but exaggeration and failure to verify facts are both very human, commonly human traits. And so, if a person who witnessed something or was involved in an incident gives his or her own account that is inaccurate, that's not necessarily unethical on their part, because there's no ethics for somebody being involved in an accident or a controversy or whatever to tell the truth. Verifying facts and being accurate is a matter of journalism ethics. So in terms of the general population creating media, they do some things that would not be ethical journalism, but because they're not practicing journalism, or at least not in their own minds practicing journalism, they don't necessarily see something wrong with passing along a rumor that they haven't checked out. But in terms of journalists, there certainly have been mistakes. I think maybe we would call them more mistakes of inexperience than, for the most part, than deliberately unethical practices. That if you were used to practicing journalism a certain way and verifying your facts on those sorts of things, and now you're practicing in a new setting, a new environment that social media and mobile devices have created, that some people, out of unfamiliarity, they're changing their processes and everything, and they still believe in verification, but they don't understand as well how you verify in social media. If I see Hurricane Sandy, which hit the United States in 2012, resulted in lots of bogus pictures circulating around in social media that were just people having fun with Photoshop. And I don't think they were being unethical. They were having fun and they were being silly. But journalists who passed that along without verifying didn't yet understand very well how to verify. They didn't understand, the way that you can look up images and see where they came from, and look in the metadata and see if they've been tampered with, and those sorts of things. So I think we're doing a good job. We've got a lot more work to do, but I think we're doing a good job of teaching verification to journalists to improve our ethics. But I don't think that journalists were deliberately, or recklessly being unethical. I think they just weren't yet sure how to apply their high ethical standards to the new tools and the new environment.
Do you think the speed to get the story out first has sort of influenced that, of the not verifying information?
Speed has always been a factor in journalists making mistakes. This was in the digital age, but it was a mistake that happened in print in the United States, it was because of deadlines. The deadlines for morning newspapers on the East Coast are about midnight Eastern time, and there was a mine disaster, the Sago mine disaster, SAGO, where 12 miners in West Virginia were trapped underground in a mine. And there was a desperate effort to rescue them. And the governor of West Virginia at the time, like right on deadline, announced that these 12 miners had been miraculously rescued. Well, he didn't have his information right yet. And in the rush to make their morning deadlines, newspapers had headlines that said miracle rescue and 12 miners rescued and things like that. One of the miners was rescued. The governor got word that there had been a miraculous rescue, and one person getting out of that was pretty miraculous, but it wasn't the full story, and he was mistaken. And journalists didn't verify that and say, okay, how do you know that? Who has talked to these miners? And of course, we didn't have time. No, I wasn't doing it, but they didn't have time. Similarly, in broadcast, and this was both broadcast. In fact, it was broadcasters got it wrong, and a blog got it right. When the U.S. Supreme Court a couple years ago upheld the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, they had sort of figured that Chief Justice Roberts might be one of the swing votes in this, and he wrote the majority decision, and they thought it would turn on whether or not the Supreme Court ruled that the law was legal under Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce. And in his first page or two of his opinion, he said no, he didn't think the Interstate Commerce Clause applied here, and so both two networks, and I think it was CNN and CBS, but I could be wrong, but they interrupted programming to broadcast that the Supreme Court had overturned the Affordable Care Act. Well, if you kept reading his ruling, further on he said no, it didn't apply to the Interstate Commerce Act, but the individual mandate that people had to buy health insurance or they would be charged, they would have to pay, fell under Congress's authority to tax. So he'd actually upheld it, but for a different reason than they thought. They thought it would swing on the Interstate Commerce Clause, and because they were reading too quickly and acting too hastily, they got it wrong. And it was a blog, SCOTUS blog, which is short for, it's kind of the acronym for Supreme Court of the United States. SCOTUS blog actually corrected it and had the first accurate account. So speed has always been a factor in journalists making mistakes. There was an argument a while back in journalism circles about, which is more important, getting it first or getting it right. And my position in all that was, if you don't have it right, you don't have it first. And I think that was a perfect example of it. CNN and CBS had it first, but they didn't have it right. So they didn't have it at all until they corrected it. So speed, deadlines for print newspapers and live TV have always forced some speed pressure that has sometimes been a factor in mistakes as journalists rush and don't do their basics of verification and getting their facts right. And certainly with the constant deadlines of digital journalism, that still happens too. But I don't blame it on speed. I blame it on carelessness. And speed is a factor in carelessness. But if you made a mistake, it's your mistake. And like I said, you didn't have it first. You didn't have it at all.
But the fact that Twitter, for example, you don't really have deadlines as such. It's just kind of who can get the first tweet out. With that kind of speed, doesn't that have an issue with verification?
Not if you think that verification is. I mean, I don't think there are very many people. I've got a friend who actually records who sends out the first, and he does it with breaking news alerts rather than with tweets. He's a media watcher in the Washington area who will record who broke a big story first. But it's minutes apart, if that. And other than a media watcher like him, or whether you beat the competition, does the media consumer really know who was first? Sure. They're looking for somebody who's going to be reliable and who's going to tell good stories and get them the news in a way that they understand it and enjoy it, and those sorts of things. So I think, certainly news people have egos. We're competitive. We like to be first. But I don't think that even, whether it's Twitter or breaking news alerts or like with the Supreme Court case, breaking into programming, that accuracy is so important. People are going to be more likely to remember that you screwed something up than they are to remember that you beat somebody by a minute.
Do you think that sort of ethical journalism practices need to be reviewed because of mobile social media?
Well, I certainly, I was a strong, I was a loud advocate that the Society of Professional Journalists needed to update its code of ethics, which had last been updated in 1996. In about 2010, I started calling for them to update their code of ethics. They did update it last year. I don't think they went far enough, and I was critical of. I participated in the process, so maybe I deserve some blame for not being persuasive enough. But they did update, so it's better than it used to be, but I think it could improve. But I think that combination of the speed that we've talked about, the new tools of social media, the importance of verification have prompted a lot of journalists to look at our ethical standards. I participated in another project called the Verification Handbook that the European Journalism Center did, that's just focusing on that one topic of verification, but it's got whole chapters on verifying videos and verifying images and verifying information from social media and user-generated content and so on. So I think there's a lot of work going on to update and improve ethical guidance.
I feel like with the 21st century that you don't necessarily need to be trained to be a journalist. With citizen journalism and the people that, listen to the journalists and believe what is said, I mean, there could be a lot of consequences.
It can be risky in various ways. I mean, when we say citizen journalists, there are people who aren't trained as journalists who are regularly practicing journalism who might be blogging about what's happening in their community. The news media either aren't covering their community or aren't covering their community the way they think it should be covered. And so they're providing some news coverage of their community. They probably don't think of themselves as a citizen journalist. But then there are kind of ad hoc situational journalists. At the Boston Marathon finish line, when that bomb went off, lots of people had cell phones and posted pictures and videos to social media. And they weren't thinking, oh my God, I'm going to be a journalist. They're thinking, oh, what happened? Here's this picture of this horrible thing that's happening that they're trying to share with their friends, or maybe they know, this is big and this could get me on the news. This could go, that there may be some level of deliberate practice of journalism there, even though they're not a journalist, but they're thinking, okay, I'm a witness to this. I need to share my story. And so journalists have to vet those and say, okay, did that, and you can look at the metadata and see, okay, did that picture come from Boston, Massachusetts? Did it come near the finish line? And those sorts of things, that the location data in the picture will often show that. But in the same instance, on Reddit, there were a lot of people who were trying to figure out who were the suspects. And they identified a missing college student, I think from Brown University, who later turned up dead, who had nothing to do with this, but they were speculating about things this person had said on the Facebook page, and this person had disappeared, and they thought the disappearance was to go commit the crime or whatever. And it was a horrible thing that they did that really caused a lot of pain for that young man's family. That was sheer speculation, and it wasn't even as much citizen journalism as citizen police work. Okay, these amateur detectives are trying to study internet clues, and we're way off. But at the same time, when the Tsarnaev brothers were identified as the suspects, and I think an important thing to notice is that traditional professional journalists make some of the same mistakes. The New York Post had a front page picture of two kids who were not the Tsarnaev brothers, and a front page headline that said "Bagmen" with a question mark, and so they're libeling these two innocent people who were really not even suspects. I don't know. I can't remember the details of how they misidentified them, but as I recall, they weren't even police suspects. But then when the Tsarnaev brothers did get tracked down by police, there was a shootout in I think in Cambridge, but in part of Boston, and there was a young man up in an apartment upstairs who was taking pictures with his cell phone and tweeting pictures and doing some live reporting that was fairly accurate and reliable, and journalists quickly tracked him down and interviewed him like you would an eyewitness, but also had his pictures, which it was dark. They weren't great pictures, but they did, both between the pictures and the tweets, it was a pretty gripping eyewitness account. So, in this one story that unfolded over a few days, we've got screw ups on social media with the Reddit. We've got screw ups by professional media with the New York Post. We've got accurate and useful eyewitness accounts at the scene of the crime and at the scene of the shootout where I think that's where one of the brothers was killed and the younger one got away. So it was really showing kind of how when news breaks, both professional journalists and citizen journalists or citizens telling what happened can be very wrong or can be very right and help tell the story. And so professional journalists, to me, need to sort through all that and find the truth and to take the time that it takes to verify what's true and what's not.
You were talking briefly about deadlines before.
Uh-huh.
With the 21st century, do you think there are, obviously newspapers and broadcasts still have deadlines, but are they as valuable now when someone can get the information within a few seconds of a story breaking?
To me, the deadline is as you can get a verifiable fact. It used to be, I spent most of my career working at print newspapers without websites, where we had a time that you had to turn in your story or it wouldn't make the morning edition. And so that was a deadline for having a whole story done. And we had to be sure it was right. Sometimes we made mistakes, but our ethic was, we're going to get it right. If we don't have it right, we'll wait till tomorrow and do a follow-up. To me, our standard of accuracy hasn't changed, but our standard of completeness changes because we've always got a deadline. And so if we have a verifiable fact, something's gone wrong at the finish line of the Boston Marathon, you can put that online and tweet that out before you've nailed down what's happened. And then you can say it looks like 2 bombs have exploded once you've verified that's happened. And there are some casualties, but we don't yet know how many. Or then you say this many injured, this many dead. They don't know who's done, who did it. They're looking for suspects, and then hours or days later, they've got some suspects, and hopefully you're not the New York Post publishing the wrong suspects or Reddit talking about the wrong suspect, but that you're getting so you've always got a deadline. But to me, the deadline is not for a complete story, it's for a verifiable fact.
So overall, you don't think that 21st century has created more speculation or hastiness?
People always speculated.
Okay.
It went by word of mouth rather than by social media. There certainly was some advantage in having more time to investigate those things. I'll give you an example, though, of where I think speculation isn't entirely bad. You have to do it carefully. Andy Carvin, who's now with First Look Media, when he was at NPR, he saw a picture on an Arab media's Facebook page. This was during the Libyan uprising, of what looked like an artillery shell with what looked like the Star of David, 6-pointed star, and a little crescent above the star. And that Arab media outlet was speculating or wondering whether this meant that Israel was arming the Libyan rebels, which would have been pretty explosive, pardon the pun, news, given Arab-Israeli relationships through the years. Well, Andy posted that with in a tweet saying they ID it as Israeli. Maybe not. Can anyone help? And so he posts the picture to his Twitter account, which had tens of thousands of followers. I'm sure he's over 100,000 now. But because he was doing such a great job of curating social media from the Arab uprisings at that time, and so he's passing on this speculation that it's Israeli. But he's raising a question about that, and he's tapping into the expertise of his tens of thousands of followers. And you know, I used to be a pretty good investigative reporter, and I think I could probably track down whether whether a shell with that markings on it came from Israel. But it might have taken me 2 or 3 weeks of digging to, find some munitions experts, show them the pictures, and yada yada. Andy debunked that in like 2 hours because he tapped into, I think this is the power of crowdsourcing. Sometimes the crowd is wrong, and so you got to check them out. But sometimes they know a lot and can find out things, that you can put them to work for you. And so people were sending him links to munitions manufacturers' pages, and he very quickly saw manufacturers' pages that had pictures of shells made in India and France that had the same markings on them. So he was pretty quickly able to say, okay, this doesn't necessarily mean it's from Israel. That's a fairly common marking. And then somebody tied him up with a history of artillery shells or something, where he was able to say that what looked like the Star of David was actually a symbol for an illumination flare that had been used back to World War II. And that crescent that went over the top was actually a symbol for a parachute. And so an illumination flare is something they use in artillery during the night to fire out to the place that you think you want to target, and it burns really brightly as it descends slowly to the ground with a parachute, and it lights it up, and you can see, okay, there's the real target over there, and you can calibrate your live ammunition and shoot it there. So it had nothing to do with Israel at all, and Andy nailed that down in about 2 hours by speculating, I don't think irresponsibly, but sharing this speculation that he had seen and asking, is that true? And kind of saying it's important for us to nail this down. And he just turned the crowd loose on that very quickly.
Another issue we were thinking about is privacy. Do you think that social media and mobile media has decreased people's privacy?
If you post information publicly on social media about yourself and what you're doing, pictures of you, I think you particularly if you make that information public. And of course, Facebook has a lot of the information private. Twitter is more public. But if you post something, first of all, if you post something publicly, you have no expectation of privacy. Certainly not in my view. Ethically and under American law, you wouldn't have any. Some other nations might view it differently. But if you post something privately to your friends, that's still publicly. It's not publicly to the whole world, but you're sharing it with some people, and you lose control of it, and whether they share it or something that we can, certainly people are not as careful about their privacy as they used to be, and so that creates some dilemmas for journalists.
Yes, thank you so much for your time,
We really
Steve.
appreciate that.
Glad to help.
It's been a really interesting insight.
Okay, take care.
Okay,
Thank you.
bye.
Bye.
Bye.